She did not knock. She had learned in 26 years of being nobody in particular that the surest way to hear the truth of a house was to stand very still just outside its door, and so Wren Calloway stood very still just outside the small parlor at Harrowmere, listening to Lady Seraphina Aldous recite, for the second time in as many minutes, an answer she had not yet been asked to give. The words were identical both times, down to the little catch of feeling on the word modest. Wren would remember that catch longer than she expected to, though she did not know it yet, standing there with her aunt's shawl over one arm and her aunt's ambitions draped rather more heavily over the other. Somewhere behind the second door down, a man's voice, low, courteous, faintly amused at his own trouble, was saying that every lady present that afternoon would be asked the same question, companions not accepted, and a ripple of soft laughter answered him as though he had made a joke rather than stated a policy. Wren did not think it was a joke. She had already seen, through the gap where the curtain did not quite meet the wall, a gentleman in dove gray slip out of the parlor a full 2 minutes before Lady Seraphina began her rehearsal, and she had already noticed that the gentleman's step was the unhurried proprietary step of a man who believed himself unwatched. She filed the observation the way her father had taught her to file a column that did not sum, without comment, without haste, for later. The house pressed close and hot around her, the tail end of August lying over Harrowmere like a hand laid flat on the back of one's neck, and somewhere above the assembled ladies a clock in the long gallery was already being consulted more often than was polite. 40 days, someone had murmured near the sweetmeats. 40 days until Michaelmas, and Michaelmas was the day the old Duke's will had named, the day on which his son must either stand married before witnesses or watch the trusteeship of Harrowmere pass whole into the hands of his cousin for 5 years more. Wren did not care, particularly, whom the Duke of Harrowmere married. She had come because her aunt, Mrs. Beatrix Farrow, had decided that a companion who could dress hair and hold her tongue was an acceptable accessory to bring within sight of a duke, and because a companion's opinion on the matter had never once been solicited in the whole of Wren's employment there. She smoothed the corner of the folded letter of introduction in her reticule, squaring it edge to edge with her thumb. A small, precise habit that had outlived every other comfort her old life had left her, and she told herself that she would answer whatever foolish question the Duke of Harrowmere put to a room full of hopeful women exactly as she was expected to, quietly, correctly, and last. She was wrong about that, though she would not learn how wrong for a little while yet. A footman in Harrowmere livery came at last to the anteroom and read out 4 names, and Lady Seraphina swept past with her rehearsed modesty already arranged upon her face, like a shawl she had chosen to match the room, and the door closed, and Wren sat with her hands folded and listened to the muffled cadence of question and answer through good English oak, unable to make out words. Only the shape of performance repeating itself, verse after verse of the same hymn. It was nearly an hour before the footman returned, and, to her own considerable surprise and her aunt's visible horror, read out a 5th name that no one had thought to expect. Miss Calloway, companion to Mrs. Farrow. She rose. She did not know yet that the room she was about to enter kept its accounts as carelessly guarded as its guest list, nor that the page waiting on the table inside had been placed there by a hand other than the Duke's own. Had she known, she would have gone in all the same, because going in was the only thing, in her whole poor arithmetic of a life, that she had ever been permitted to do for herself. The parlor was smaller than its reputation, and cooler, and the Duke of Harrowmere did not rise when she entered, which she took at first for insolence and then, watching him, for simple economy of motion, a man who did not spend a gesture he did not need. Alaric vein was broad through the shoulder, in the manner of men who had once ridden hard for pleasure, and now rode hard from necessity, and his hands, folded on the table before him, were a laborer's hands set incongruously beneath a signet ring, scarred faintly across the knuckles, in a way no tailor could have arranged. He watched her cross the room with an attention that had nothing of flirtation in it, and everything of appraisal, the way a buyer looks at a horse he suspects has been misrepresented to him. "Miss Calloway," he said, and there was the ghost of an apology in it, though his face gave away no more than his voice. "You are not obliged to sit for this. I am told companions rarely are considered candidates. I had gathered as much, Your Grace," Wren said, and sat without being asked twice, because sitting seemed the more dignified use of the silence than standing to be looked at. "Then why do you ask it of me at all?" "Because I have sat this afternoon with 11 ladies," he said, "and heard 11 variations of the same speech, and I have begun to suspect the fault is in my question rather than in their honesty. A companion is under no obligation to flatter me. I thought I might learn something from a witness with nothing to gain." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a fair copy of a household ledger page, columns of purchase and provision ruled in a clerkly hand, and said, in the tone of a man reciting a line he had used 11 times already that day, and expected to use a 12th, "Tell me what is wrong with the page. Not what is right with it. Everyone finds something right with it." Wren looked down. She had grown up at her father's elbow, doing exactly this. Before the world had decided her father was a thief for having found, once, precisely this kind of wrongness in someone else's books, and the old habit rose in her like breath returning to a body thought drowned. She did not answer quickly, because a true answer is never quick, and the Duke did not fill the silence, which she noted and approved of without permitting her face to say so. "The total is correct," she said at last, "which is why no one has questioned it. But the third column has been added twice in different pens, 3 weeks apart by the look of the ink, and the sum of those 2 additions happens, by no very great coincidence, to equal the figure carried forward at the bottom, in a hand that isn't the steward's own. I could not tell you what it means, Your Grace. I can only tell you that it does not add itself the way the rest of the page does." Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite alarm, and was not quite delight, and settled, before she could name it, into stillness. "No one else," he said slowly, mentioned the ink. "No one else was made to read figures instead of admire them," Wren said, and immediately wondered if she had gone too far, and found, to her further surprise, that his mouth had performed the smallest possible motion in the direction of a smile before he closed the book of himself again. The way a man closes a door he does not wish opened twice in one afternoon. He asked her nothing further of substance. He asked her, instead, how long she had served her aunt, and whether she found the position tolerable, and whether, this last almost carelessly, as though it cost him nothing to ask, her people had always been in service. She told him the plain, unadorned shape of it. A father who had kept books for a wool merchant in the north until an error not his own had been laid at his door. A mother dead before that. A girl of 19 left to make her arithmetic serve where her fortune could not. She did not tell him the rest. There was a rest, and she had learned that a secret told all at once is a secret given away rather than shared, and she had nothing else left in the world that was entirely her own to give. When the interview ended, he did rise, then, briefly, and inclined his head to her as he had not troubled to do on her entrance, and outside in the corridor an elderly woman in housekeeper's black was waiting with her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested she had heard every word through the same gap in the curtain Wren herself had used not an hour before. "Well," said Mrs. Editha Hollis, who had nursed the old Duchess and outlived her opinions of half the county, You're the first one all day to come out of that room looking as though you'd been asked a question instead of given a cue." "I only told him what was on the page," Wren said. Said Mrs. Hollis, in the tone of a woman filing that answer away exactly as Wren had filed the gentleman in dove gray, for later. "That'll be why he's still sitting in there, staring at the door." She did not see the gentleman in dove gray again until the guests had begun to disperse into the long gallery for tea, the ladies fanning themselves and comparing notes on the Duke's peculiar little examination, as though it were a new dance whose steps might yet be mastered with practice, and when she did see him it was because he had arranged to be seen, stepping into her path near a window with the unhurried confidence of a man used to being given room. "Miss Calloway," he said, and smiled with a warmth that did not reach any part of him below the mouth. "Miss Julian Price, cousin to his grace, and, for my sins, the keeper of most of what passes for order in this house. I understand you gave rather a memorable answer this afternoon." "I gave an honest one, sir. I hadn't realized those were rare enough here to be memorable." "They are rarer than you'd think," he said, and there was nothing in his voice to object to, and everything in it, somehow, that made the fine hairs rise along her arms, the way a room feels colder before one has located the open window. He smoothed his cuff with 2 fingers, an idle motion, a small ring on his smallest finger catching the light. "A word of friendly counsel, since no one else here is like to offer it to a companion. A clever woman in a house like this is watched a good deal more closely than a pretty one. It would be a pity if your cleverness were mistaken by someone less generous than myself, for something less becoming. Point it modestly, Miss Calloway, and only where you are asked to." He bowed and was gone before she could decide whether she had been threatened or advised, which she suspected was precisely the effect he had intended. Below stairs, she would learn before the week was out, a book had already been opened among the footmen on which lady the Duke would choose, with 3-1 against the companion who had talked about ink, and even odds on Lady Seraphina, whose mother was said to have paid a caller's fee to a ladies' magazine to have the correct rehearsed sentiment printed and posted to her a full week in advance. Wren found she did not mind the odds. She minded, rather more, a small and stubborn splinter of fact that had lodged itself under her thoughts and would not be shaken loose, that the ink on the second edition to that ledger's 3rd column had been noticeably darker and fresher than the ink surrounding it, darker than 3 weeks ought to leave any ink that had not been kept very carefully from air and light, and that Mr. Julian Price's hands, when he had smoothed his cuff just now, had shown the same faint bluish stain along the side of the smallest finger that a man gets from resting a pen too long against damp skin. She did not know what it meant yet. She only knew, the way her father had known such things before her, that a number which does not add itself honestly is a small lit lamp left burning where someone hoped the room would stay dark, and that a woman with nothing else to her name could still, if she chose, be the sort of person who noticed when a lamp was lit. The task Mrs. Hollis brought her 3 days later had the appearance of charity and the substance, Wren understood at once, of an invitation. The parish accounts for the almshouse at Haramir's Gate had fallen 3 years into arrears of proper reckoning. No fault of anyone's malice, only of an old clerk's failing eyes, and someone, she did not ask who, though she had a fair notion, had suggested that Mrs. Farrow's clever companion might be spared an afternoon to set the columns straight. She was given a table in the estate office, a good north light, and, more often than the errand strictly required, the company of the Duke himself, who found reasons of his own to be at the far end of the same long room, with correspondence he did not appear to be answering with any urgency. "You hum when you carry a column," he observed on the second afternoon, not looking up from the letter he was not writing. I didn't know I did. Under your breath. 4 notes. Always the same 4. Whenever the sum comes out even. My father used to do it, Ren said. And then, because the room was quiet and the light was kind and no one had asked her a question she needed to guard herself against in a long while, she told him more of it than she had told anyone since it happened. The wool merchant's discrepancy that her father had found and reported in good faith. The merchant's partner who had made the discrepancy vanish and her father's honesty appear in its place. The 3 years of debt and disgrace that had followed. And the small marbled account book, his own private ledger of the case, that she still kept wrapped in linen at the bottom of her trunk, though she had never once been able to prove what was written in it. He believed numbers told the truth even when people had stopped, she said. He used to say, a column will not flatter you. That's why he trusted it further than he trusted most men. A hard philosophy for a hard end, the Duke said, and something in his voice suggested he was thinking of a philosophy of his own, arrived at by a similarly hard road, though he did not share it. Not yet. He asked whether the account book still existed, and she said that it did, and that she had never shown it to anyone, and did not say why, though the why sat plainly enough between them. A woman with nothing may keep exactly one thing entirely to herself, and she had chosen that. He let the subject lie, which she was grateful for. What she had not expected, an hour later, was to make him laugh. Truly laugh, a short, startled sound quickly suppressed, when she remarked, apropos of a column of candle expenditures that had somehow doubled in a house with no more residents than it had ever had, that either Haromir had taken to burning candles at both ends in the literal sense, or somebody downstairs had developed a taste for. Reading in the dark. Mrs. Hollis, arranging flowers at the sideboard, went very still and looked between them with an expression Ren could not read and did not try very hard to. I don't believe I have heard His Grace laugh at anything narrower than a horse race since his father's funeral, she said afterward, when the Duke had gone, in the flat voice of a woman reporting a fact of some significance to the historical record. Don't let it go to your head, Miss Calloway. But don't let it go unnoticed, either. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as concern, which is how the worst blows generally arrive. Ren was sent for on a morning when the heat had at last begun to break into something heavier and more electric, summoned not to the estate office but to the small parlor where she had first been examined, and found the Duke standing rather than sitting, which she understood before he spoke a word to mean that whatever was coming, he had already decided how it would end. Mr. Price stood at his shoulder with an expression of grave and beautifully rehearsed reluctance. Miss Calloway, the Duke said, and his voice had gone somewhere colder and further away than the room he was standing in. I am told the almshouse ledger you corrected shows alterations in more places than the arrears you were asked to true. I am told the 3rd column of the household accounts you examined on your first day here, the very page, in fact, that impressed me so particularly, bears an addition in ink that did not exist before you were left alone with it. Ren felt the floor of the world tilt very slightly and steadied herself the only way she knew, by refusing to let her hands do anything but lie still in her lap. That is not true, Your Grace. I have Mr. Price's word and the clerk's that the ink was examined before your visit and after, and differs. Then examine it a 3rd time, in better light. With someone present who has no reason to wish either answer, Ren said, and heard her own voice hold steady even as something inside her did not. I told you what I saw on that page because you asked me to see it. I did not alter a single figure on it, then or since, and I would ask you to consider Your Grace, who among the people now assuring you otherwise stood to lose the least by my having been believed. Price's face performed sorrow with great fluency. "It grieves me more than I can say to bring this forward," he said, in the gentle voice he kept for occasions requiring the most damage. "But a house cannot afford a clever companion whose cleverness may run in more than one direction. I would not have the family's confidence in her honesty misplaced twice." It was Mrs. Farrow, summoned in turn, who delivered the coup that Price had not needed to deliver himself, informing Wren in the carriage home that a sum of £40 and a character reference of unimpeachable warmth awaited her the moment she agreed to withdraw quietly from Haramir's notice, to admit nothing and deny nothing and simply cease, by her absence, to be a question anyone need answer. £40 was more money than Wren had held in her whole adult life. It would have paid 2 years' lodging of her own, freedom of a kind she had never once been offered. She thought of her father, who had been offered something similar once, a quiet withdrawal of his complaint in exchange for a small settlement and no further ruin, and who had refused it because a column that does not add itself honestly does not become honest by being paid to be silent about it. "Tell my aunt," Wren said to the maid who had been sent with the offer, "that I am obliged for her concern, and that I will take neither the money nor the silence, because I did nothing that requires either." She said it knowing it would very likely cost her the roof over her head. She found, saying it, that she did not regret the cost nearly so much as she had feared she would. Her aunt gave her a fortnight and a face like a shut ledger, and at the end of the fortnight, Wren was in a rented room above a chandler's shop with her trunk, her few dresses, and the small marbled account book that had crossed 3 counties with her without ever once being opened for anyone but herself. She opened it now, by candlelight, for the first time in a year, and read her father's cramped, patient hand setting down, column by column, the exact method by which a dishonest partner had once skimmed a wool merchant's accounts, a genuine entry made, a second false entry added weeks later in a different ink to correct the first upward, the difference quietly pocketed, the whole disguised by a total that still, miraculously, balanced. She read it twice before her hands went cold with the recognition, because it was not merely similar to what she had seen in Haramir's ledger. It was identical, stroke for stroke, as though the same hand, or a hand taught by the same hand, had done both. Her father had written, in the margin beside his final entry, a single unadorned sentence she had read 100 times without hearing it until now. "A false sum forgives itself nothing. It only waits for someone patient enough to ask it twice." She sat with that sentence a long while as the candle guttered low, and where despair might reasonably have settled in its place there, came instead something colder and more useful, a resolve with edges. A knock came near midnight, soft and furtive, and when she opened the door it was not Mrs. Hollis, as she had half hoped, but a thin, ink-stained young man she recognized as Mr. Silas Gray, the estate's junior clerk, who stood twisting his cuff and would not quite meet her eye. "I copied the figures Mr. Price brought me," he said, low and fast, as though the sentence might not survive being said slowly. "I didn't know what they were for at first, Miss Calloway, I swear it, and by the time I understood, I was too far in to say so without losing my place and my character both. I've come to tell you I'm sorry, and I've come to tell you nothing else, because if I say more, he'll know it was me, and I haven't the courage yet to be the one who says it first." He was gone into the dark before she could answer him, leaving her with a single fact and 100 unanswered ones, that Silas Gray knew something, that Silas Gray was afraid, and that a man afraid of losing his place could, with the right question asked at the right moment, become a man more afraid of keeping his silence. She sat by the dying candle, turning her father's book over in her hands, and asked herself the question she could not yet answer. if she went forward now, with proof only her own eyes, and her father's ruined name behind it? Who among the great house of Haramir would believe a dismissed companion over a duke's own cousin and trustee? The answer, it turned out, was Mrs. Editha Hollis, who arrived at the chandler's shop 3 mornings later in a hired gig with her bonnet on crooked and her patience entirely gone. "I have held my tongue a fortnight out of respect for what I don't properly understand," she announced without preamble, "and I am done holding it. His Grace has not laughed once since you left this house, and a man who has stopped laughing is a man beginning, very slowly, to ask himself who benefited from his stopping. I've told him you kept a book of your father's. I did not tell him what was in it, because I don't know, and because some things a woman ought to say for herself." Wren brought the marbled ledger, and they went together, not to the Duke first, but to Mr. Thomas Abernathy, the family's solicitor and trustee's counterpart, a spare and exacting man who had drafted the old Duke's will himself and had Mrs. Hollis confided, harbored his own private unease about Price's stewardship for above a year, without ever finding the thread to pull. Abernathy laid the household ledger and Wren's father's private book side by side upon his desk, and studied them for the better part of an hour without speaking, and when he did speak, it was in the careful voice of a man who has just found, with equal parts relief and dread, the shape of a thing he had long suspected, but never proved. "This is not coincidence of method," he said. "This is instruction, Miss Calloway, passed from one hand to another, and I think I know whose hand taught it first, though I shall not say the name until I can say it before witnesses and have it stand." He sent, that same afternoon, notice to the Duke that the estate's quarterly accounts, ordinarily reviewed at Michaelmas with the trustee's own figures accepted on his word, would this year be reviewed early and in full with the original ledgers produced. It was a small procedural letter, dry as dust to any eye but the one it was meant for, and Mrs. Hollis, who had learned the household's currents over 40 years better than any clock, reported that Mr. Price had gone quite pale reading his copy of it, and had, for the first time anyone below stairs could remember, sent his valet away so that he might smooth his own cuffs alone. The storm that had been gathering all that pressing, breathless month broke at last on the night the accounts were laid open, thunder rolling flat and continuous over Haramir's roofs, as though the sky itself had been asked, at long last, to account for something. The library had been arranged with more chairs than a library usually holds, the Duke at its head, Abernathy at his right, with both ledgers before him, Mrs. Farrow and Lady Seraphina among the guests who had somehow not yet gone home from the district, and would not, on their lives, have missed this, the housekeeper and half the senior staff standing along the wall, in the particular attentive silence of people who have waited a long time to be proven right about something. Wren stood near the window with her father's book held against her, and when Abernathy called her forward she came, and set the small marbled ledger open upon the table beside the estate's own, and turned each to the matching page, and said, in a voice she was careful to keep level though the room had gone entirely still around her, "My father discovered this method 8 years ago in a wool merchant's accounts in the north, and was ruined for discovering it, because the man who taught it to his clerk was clever enough to make the discovery look like the crime. I did not know, when I first read the household page I was shown in this house, that I was looking at the same hand's work. I know it now. A true entry is made, and weeks later a second entry is added in fresh ink to correct the first upward, and the difference is drawn off before the next audit, and the total, God forgive the cleverness of it, still balances." She read her father's marginal note aloud into the silence. A false sum forgives itself nothing. It only waits for someone patient enough to ask it twice. and set the two books side by side so that anyone in the room might come and see the identical hand of instruction written 8 years and 2 counties apart. It was Abernathy, not Wren, who turned then to Silas Gray, summoned that evening on the pretext of assisting with the ledgers, and asked him the single precise question the whole room had been waiting, without knowing it, to hear asked. "Whose hand instructed you in this method? Mr. Gray, look at me." Not at Mr. Price, at me. Gray's composure, thin as a clerk's coat in winter, gave way entirely. He named Julian Price in a voice that broke twice over the syllables and produced from his own coat, trembling, 3 letters he had kept against just such a night as this one, in Price's own unmistakable hand, instructing the exact adjustments now lying open on the table. Abernathy read them aloud, and the room that had been so silent made a single collective sound, not of triumph but of something closer to grief, as though a wound long suspected had finally, mercifully, been named. Price did not run and did not rage. He stood very still, turning the small ring on his smallest finger round and round, and when at last he spoke, it was not to deny it, but to explain it, in a voice gone suddenly and entirely without its usual gentle music. "My father held half this fortune once, before your father's father bought him out of it, for a price my father called fair, and I have always called theft," he said to the Duke, and for the first time all evening he looked less like a villain than like a man, much older and much sadder than his years. "And I have spent every quarter of my stewardship watching you inherit, effortlessly, the thing he spent his life mourning the loss of. I told myself I was only taking back, slowly, what arithmetic alone had once taken from us. I did not tell myself, until tonight, that arithmetic never took anything from anyone. Men do that." The Duke of Heromere looked at his cousin for a long moment, and Wren, watching him, understood that he was choosing, in that silence, not what his cousin deserved, but what kind of man he himself intended to remain. "You will have an allowance sufficient to live without disgrace, and passage abroad within the month," he said at last, "and you will have my silence on the particulars, for the sake of a name that is yours as much as mine, and for the sake of the innocent people in this house who would be made to carry your shame if it were spoken aloud in every drawing-room from here to London. This is not kindness to you, Julian. It is protection of everyone you have not yet finished ruining." Lady Seraphina, pale and unexpectedly near tears, rose then to say what she had apparently carried alone for weeks, that Mr. Price had hinted to her, before the ledger test was ever set, precisely which answer would please his grace, and that she had given it because she had wanted, very badly, to be chosen, and had been too frightened of losing that chance to ask herself why a stranger's cousin should know the Duke's own mind so well. It cost her something to say it in that room, and the Duke, to his credit, thanked her for the saying, rather than punishing her for the having done it, which Wren thought, watching, was its own small mercy quietly extended. It was 3 days later, the storm long since burned itself out into a clean, cool morning that smelled of wet stone and the first turned leaves, that the Duke of Heromere came himself to the chandler's shop, without Mrs. Hollis, without Abernathy, without any of the apparatus of rank he might have hidden behind, and asked Wren Calloway to walk with him along the lane, because he had a question he wished to ask her that had nothing whatever to do with any ledger. "The estate is settled," he said, when they had gone some way in a silence that was, for once, entirely comfortable. "The trusteeship reverts to me outright regardless of Michaelmas now. The will's condition or no, Abernathy has seen to that, and so I find I no longer have any need in this world to marry by any particular date, for any practical reason at all. I tell you this first, because I would not have you wonder later whether what I am about to ask was asked to save an inheritance. I hadn't wondered it, Ren said, though I thank you for saying so. There is nothing wrong with this page, he said then, and produced from his coat. Absurdly, a single blank sheet of paper, and held it out to her the way he had once held out a ledger full of another man's dishonesty. For once, tell me only that. There is nothing wrong with it, she said, and found her voice was not quite steady after all. Then marry me because you find nothing wrong with it either, he said, and for no other reason on this earth. Not gratitude, not rescue, not the 40 pounds you were too proud to take. Marry me because it is you I have wanted to hear tell me the truth of a room, in every sense of that word, since the first afternoon you sat down and told me my own house was lying to me. She married him quietly, at Michaelmas after all, though by then the date carried no weight but its own sweetness, in a small stone chapel with Mrs. Hollis weeping without shame into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, and Abernathy standing witness with the particular satisfaction of a man who has finally seen a column close correctly. Silas Gray, whose honesty at the last had cost him his old post, but earned him a fair character and a steadier position in the county surveyor's office, sent a wedding gift of a new account book bound in plain cloth, with a note hoping its owner would never again have cause to hide one in linen at the bottom of a trunk. Lady Seraphina, some months on, was quietly and rather happily engaged to Abernathy's own thoughtful nephew, a match made of two people who had both, in their different ways, learned that season what it cost to speak a truth aloud, and valued each other the more for having finally managed it. Julian Price wrote once a year from a small house near Lyon, restrained and grieving letters that spoke of gardens and never once of ledgers, and the Duke read each one through before setting it, without comment, into the fire. Wren's father's name was cleared before the wool merchant's old creditors within the year. His account book bound at last in leather, and kept, no longer hidden, in the Harrowmere library beside the ledgers it had helped to expose. Almost a year after the night of the storm, in the full green heat of another late summer, the Duchess of Harrowmere stood in the same corridor where she had once waited with her aunt's shawl over her arm, listening now not to a rehearsed answer, but to a very young, very frightened girl, practicing an honest one under her breath, having been told, kindly, by the housekeeper, that, in this house at least, no one need recite a speech to be seen. Wren crossed the corridor and knelt to the girl's height, and told her, in words she had once needed and never received, that nobody looks twice at a small brown bird until the moment it opens its mouth, and that the moment was always worth the waiting for. If this story warmed you, if you have ever sat in a corridor somewhere, certain no one would call your name and been called anyway, then come sit by this fire a while longer. There is a chair kept for exactly this, and the kettle has not yet gone off the boil. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you longest: the ink that didn't match, the blank page held out like a peace offering, or the girl in the corridor learning she needn't recite anything at all. Stay a while. Keep your place by the fire with a subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one told, and until then, sleep well and be gentle with the quiet, overlooked ones who are only waiting to be asked the right question.